doing? 薪水，求求义工帮我一周每周3，政府能否给我开个请假条？机位能否把我全部都填满？帮我快快帮我把薪水退回，拜托月老你给我签个手信。我是真的不想上班，我想在家里吹着空调玩着平板。其实现在不可以靠平板啦，就是现实下的让我烦都烦。
My personal war in the midst of war, the struggle against the betrayal of reason by the current mass passion, the struggle for intellectual brotherhood. Retirement in itself proved useless. The atmosphere remained oppressive, and just because of that I became aware that mere passive non-participation in this wild derogation of the enemy was not conclusive. After all, one was a writer and had the gift of words, and with it the duty of expressing one's convictions as far as that was possible under the censorship. I attempted to do so. I wrote an article called To Friends Abroad, in which, in direct and blunt contrast to the accustomed fanfares of hate, I announced to all friends in foreign countries that, although relations were now impossible, I would remain loyal to them so that, at the very first opportunity, we might again collaborate in the reconstruction of European culture. I sent it to the most widely read German paper. To my amazement, the Berliner Tageblatt did not hesitate to print it entire. Only one passage, no matter who may be victorious, was censored because even the slightest doubt that Germany would emerge victorious from the World War was not permitted at that time. But even without this limitation, my article brought me a number of indignant letters from super patriots. They could not understand how one could have anything in common with those rascally opponents in such an hour. I was not very much hurt. Throughout my life, it had never been my purpose to convert others to my opinions. It sufficed for me to be permitted to express them, and to express them openly. 2 weeks later, when I had almost forgotten about my article, I received a letter with a Swiss postage stamp and marked passed by censor, and the familiar handwriting told me that it came from Romain Roland. He must have read my article, for he wrote, Non, G, any quitterai jamais mes amus. I sensed immediately that these few lines were an attempt to see if it were possible to correspond with an Austrian friend in wartime. I replied at once. From that time on, we wrote to each other regularly, and our correspondence continued for more than 25 years until the Second War, more brutal than the first, disrupted all connections between nations. This letter was one of the high points of happiness in my life. It came to me like a white dove out of the ark of bellowing, stamping, raging wild beasts. I no longer felt alone, but once again linked with someone of my own convictions. I felt myself strengthened by Roland's greater spiritual strength. I knew how wonderfully Roland was proving his humanity beyond the frontier. He had found the only right path for a writer to take in such times. Not to participate in destruction and murder, but following the great example of Walt Whitman, who served as a hospital orderly in the Civil War, to be active in works of assistance and humanity. Living in Switzerland, exempt from all military duty because of his poor health, he had immediately offered his services to the Red Cross in Geneva, where he happened to be at the outbreak of the war, and labored there in the overcrowded rooms day after day in the magnificent work for which I later tried to express thanks publicly in an article called The Heart of Europe. After the murderous battles of the first weeks, all connections were broken off. In all countries, relatives did not know whether or not their sons, their brothers, their fathers had fallen, or were merely visiting as prisoners. They did not know where to inquire, for no answer was due to the The Red Cross took over the task of mediating human research about the prison camp.
Where you want to go?
Controversial literature of its own. For this was the favorable difference between the First World War and the Second. In the first, the world still had power. It had not yet been done to death by the organization of lies, by propaganda, and people still considered the written word illiterate. Whereas in 1939, not a single pronouncement by any writer had the slightest effect either for good or evil, and up to the present essay or poem has stirred the masses to their core. In 1914, a 48-line poem like Lissar's Hymn of Hate, an inane manifesto like that of the 93 German intellectuals, or an 8-page essay such as Roland's Odysseus de la Mêlée, or a novel like Barbusse's Le Fou became an event. The moral conscience of the world had not yet become as tired or washed out as it is today. It reacted vehemently to every obvious lie, to every violation of international law and of humanity, with the whole force of centuries of conviction. A violation such as Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium, which today, since Hitler elevated lying to a matter of course and anti-humanitarianism to law, would hardly be complained of seriously, could then still arouse the world from end to end. The shooting of Edith Cavell and the torpedoing of the Lusitania were more harmful to Germany than a battle lost, thanks to the universal outburst of moral indignation. And so it was by no means vain for the poet, the writer, to speak out at that time when the ear and the soul had not yet been flooded with the incessant chattering waves of the radio. On the contrary, the spontaneous manifestation of a great poet was 1,000 times more effective than all of the official speeches of the statesmen, who were known to be geared tactically and politically to the immediate moment, and to speak half-truths at best. In this feeling of confidence in the poet as the highest guarantee of pure sentiments, there was infinitely more belief on the part of that generation that later was to be so disappointed. Aware of this authority of the poet, military leaders and officials sought to secure the services of the men of moral and intellectual prestige for their purposes. They were needed to declare, to prove, to confirm that all the injustice, all the evil was piled up on the other side, and that all truth and all righteousness were on the side of their own nation. They could not get Roland to do this. He did not see it as his duty to intensify the atmosphere sultry with hatred and heavy through every kind of incitement, but, on the contrary, to purify it. Whoever reads the 8 pages of the famous Odysseus de la Mêlée today will in all probability no longer comprehend its tremendous effect. All that Roland postulated in it connotes, if read coolly and clearly, nothing but the most obvious of obvious truths. But these words were written in a time of mass insanity that can hardly be reconstructed today. When the article appeared, the French super patriots cried out as if they had picked up a red hot iron by mistake. In a trice, Roland was boycotted by his oldest friends. The booksellers no longer dared to display Jean Christophe. The military authorities, who needed hatred to stimulate their soldiers, were already considering measures against him. One pamphlet after the other appeared with the argument, "Ce qu'on donne pendant la guerre à l'humanité est vol de la patrie." But as always, the outcry proved that the blow had struck home. The discussion as to the attitude of the intellectuals in the war could no longer be halted, and the problem was posed inescapably before every individual. I regret nothing more in these memoirs than that I no longer have access to Roland's letters of those years. The thought that they may be destroyed or lost in this new deluge weighs upon me as a heavy responsibility. For much as I love all his works, I believe that the time may come when those letters will be counted among the loveliest and the most humane that his great heart and passionate reason ever brought forth. Out of the measureless despair of a compassionate soul, out of the entire force of powerless bitterness, written to a friend beyond the border, officially an enemy, they may possibly be the most penetrating moral documents of a time where understanding was a gigantic manifestation of strength, and loyalty to one's own beliefs in itself demanded grandiose courage. Our friendly correspondence soon crystallized into a definite project. Roland suggested that we attempt to invite the important intellectual personalities of all nations to a conference in Switzerland, in order to achieve a more uniform and dignified attitude, and perhaps, even, to address a united appeal for conciliation to the world. He, for his part, was prepared to invite the French and those of other lands to participate, and I was to take care of the Austrians and Germans in so far as they had not already compromised themselves by taking an open part in the propaganda of hate. I went to work at once. The most important and most representative German poet at that time was Gerhard Hauptmann. In order to make it easier for him to accept or to decline, I did not wish to approach him directly. So I wrote to our common friend Walter Rathenau, asking him to sound out Hauptmann confidentially. Rathenau refused. I never learned whether he did so with or without Hauptmann's knowledge, saying that the time for an intellectual understanding was not ripe. With that, the whole plan faded, for then Thomas Mann was in the other camp, and had just expressed the German legal point of view in an article on Frederick the Great. Rilke, who I knew was on our side, refused to participate in any public and joint action as a matter of principle. Demmel, the former socialist, proudly, with juvenile patriotism, signed his letters Lieutenant Demmel, and private conversations had convinced me that we could not count on Hofmannsthal or Jacob Wassermann. There was not much to be hoped for on the German side, and Roland was hardly more successful in France. In 1914 and 1915, it was still too early, and for the people of the hinterland the war was still too distant. We stood alone. Alone, yet not entirely alone. We had yet accomplished something through our exchange of letters, a preliminary survey of the few dozen people in the warring or neutral nations upon whom we could count and who thought along our lines. We could direct each other's attention to books, articles, and pamphlets here and there. A certain crystallization point had been assured, to which, hesitatingly at first, but always more strongly because of the ever growing pressure of the times, new elements could adhere. This feeling of not being entirely in the void encouraged me from time to time to write articles that would draw answers and reactions from the isolated and hidden people who sympathized with us. In spite of all, the important newspapers of Germany and Austria were at my disposal, which assured an important sphere of activity. And strangely enough, there was no danger of opposition in principle from the authorities, for I never touched on current politics. Because of the effect of the liberal spirit, respect for all things literary was still very great, and when I reread the articles which I was then able to smuggle out into the open, I cannot withhold my respect for the generosity of the Austrian military authorities. It was possible for me in the midst of the World War to give enthusiastic praise to Berta von Suttner, the founder of pacifism, who had branded war as a crime of crimes, and to report in detail on Barbusse's Le Feu in an Austrian newspaper. Obviously, we had to utilize a certain technique in spreading our inopportune views to the general public in a time of war. In order to picture the horrors of the war to the indifferent hinterland it was, of course, necessary for me to dwell upon the sufferings of a French soldier in my article Le Feu, but hundreds of letters from the Austrian front proved how clearly our people had recognized their own fate in that description. Or, in order to express our own convictions, we adopted a method of apparently attacking one another. For example, one of my French friends took issue with my To Friends Abroad in the Mercure de France. By this attack, in which he printed every single word of my article in translation, he had succeeded in smuggling it over into France where everyone could read it. And that, of course, had been his intention. In such manner signal lights went up which were nothing but signs of mutual recognition. How clearly they were understood by those for whom they were intended was later demonstrated to me by a slight incident. When in May 1915 Italy declared war upon Austria, its former ally, a wave of hatred ensued. Everything Italian was insulted, Dante was annexed. That is, it was ceremoniously declared that the only great, supposedly Italian poet had been a Teuton, just as France had suddenly claimed Beethoven as a Belgian. It chanced that in the memoirs of a young Italian of the time of the Risorgimento, Carlo Porio by name, which had just appeared, there was a description of a visit to Goethe. In order to point out, in the midst of all this manifestation of hate, that the Italians had always been closely and sympathetically allied to our culture, I wrote a rather pointed article called An Italian Visits Goethe. And as the book had an introduction by Benedetto Croce, I took the opportunity of devoting a few words to my high esteem for the latter. Words of admiration for an Italian uttered in Austria at a time when one was not supposed to pay homage to any enemy writer or scholar could not, but signify something ulterior, and as such they were recognized beyond our borders. Croce, who was then in the Italian government, told me later how one of the employees of the ministry, who could not read German, had informed him in some dismay that Croce had been attacked in the principal enemy newspaper, for he could not conceive of a reference to the minister as being other than unfriendly. Croce ordered a copy of the Neue Freie Presse and was at first astonished to read words of admiration instead, then pleasantly amused. It is far from my purpose to overestimate these small, isolated essays. It goes without saying that they had not the slightest effect upon the course of events, but they helped us as well as many an unknown reader. They eased the horrible isolation, the spiritual despair, in which the truly humane person of the 20th century found himself, as he finds himself today, after 25 years, again as powerless against the overpowering, if, as I fear, not even more so. At that time, I was perfectly aware of the fact that I could not shake off my real burden by these small protests and devices. Slowly, I began to develop the plan of a work that was to enable me not only to express certain ideas, but also my considered attitude to time and race, catastrophe and war. However, in order to describe the war in a poetic synthesis, I lacked the most important thing. I had not seen it. I had been anchored in an office for almost a year, and there, in the invisible distance, the actual, true horror of war was being enacted. I had had opportunities to go to the front, and on 3 occasions important newspapers had offered me an assignment as war correspondent. But any sort of description would have carried the obligation to depict the war in an exclusively positive and patriotic sense, and I had sworn to myself, oath which I still kept in 1940, never to write a single word that affirmed war or disparaged another nation. But an opportunity presented itself by chance. The great Austro-German offensive had broken through the Russian lines at Tarnow in the spring of 1915, and Galicia and Poland had been conquered in one concentric attack. Now the War Archives wished to secure for its files all the original Russian proclamations and placards in the occupied Austrian area before they had been torn down or otherwise destroyed. The colonel, who happened to be aware of my collector's technique, asked me if I wished to undertake the task. Of course, I accepted at once, and I was given a passport which permitted me to travel on any military train and to move about freely wherever I chose without being assigned to any definite division and without having to report to any particular office or superior. This caused a number of the strangest occurrences, for I was not an officer, but merely a titular sergeant major. Respect for the officers at the front, and the officials thought that I must be some officer of the general staff in disguise, or that I had been entrusted with some mysterious task. Since I avoided the officers' mess and stopped at hotels, I achieved the additional advantage of being outside of the great machine and seeing whatever I wished to see without official guiding. My set task, that of collecting the proclamations, did not burden me greatly. Whenever I came into one of the Galician cities, Tarnow, Drohobix, or Limburg, I found a few Jews, so-called agents, whose profession it was to provide whatever one wished. It sufficed for me to tell one of these universal geniuses that I desired to obtain the proclamations and placards of the Russian occupation, and he ran off like a weasel and transmitted my wish in some mysterious fashion to dozens of other subagents. Within 3 hours, without having taken a step myself, all the material had been collected for me in as complete a fashion as could be imagined. Because of this exemplary organization, I had time to see much, and I saw much. Above all else, I saw the terrible misery of the civilian population, upon whose eyes the horror of what they had experienced lay like a shadow. I saw the unsuspected misery of the Jews in the ghettos, where 8 or 12 of them would live in one room level with the ground or in a cellar. And for the first time, I saw the enemy. In Tarnow, I came upon the first transport of captured Russian soldiers. Fenced within a large square, they sat about on the ground, smoking and chatting, guarded by 2 or 3 dozen mature, bearded Tyrolese militia who were as tattered and torn as their captives, and had but little in common with the smart, clean-shaven, brilliantly uniformed soldiers we saw pictured in the illustrated papers at home. But the guard had nothing martial or severe about it. The captives did not display the slightest desire to escape, nor the Austrian militia the slightest inclination to be strict about their duties. They sat about in a neighborly fashion with their captives, and the very fact that they could not understand each other's language caused huge enjoyment. They exchanged cigarettes and laughed at each other. A Tyrolese militiaman was just taking some pictures of his wife and children out of a very old and dirty pocketbook and showing them to the enemy, who passed them about amongst themselves, asking the Austrian by means of their fingers if this child was 3 or 4. I could not escape the feeling that these simple, primitive people had understood the war more truly than our university professors and poets, namely, as a disaster that had come over them with which they had had nothing to do, and that everyone who had happened into this misfortune was somehow a brother. This knowledge comforted me on my entire trip past the shelled cities and the plundered shops, whose contents lay about in the middle of the streets like broken limbs or torn out entrails. Then, too, the well-tilled fields in between the war areas made me hope that in a few years all the destruction would have disappeared. Obviously, at that time, I was unable to conceive that just as quickly as the traces of the war would disappear from the face of the earth, the memory of its horrors would also as quickly disappear from the minds of men. I did not face the actual horrors of war during those first days, and when I did, they exceeded my worst imaginings. As there were practically no passenger trains, on occasion I rode on an open artillery car, sitting on a caisson, or in one of the cattle cars where men completely tired out slept alongside and on top of each other in the midst of stench and filth, and while they were being led to the slaughter, already looked like slaughtered cattle. But the worst of all were the hospital trains which I had to use 2 or 3 times. How little they resembled the well-lighted, white, carefully cleaned ambulance trains in which the archduchesses and the fashionable ladies of Viennese society had their pictures taken as nurses at the beginning of the war. What I saw to my dismay were ordinary freight cars without real windows, with only one narrow opening for air, lighted within by sooty oil lamps. One crude stretcher stood next to the other, and all were occupied by moaning, sweating, deathly pale men, who were gasping for breath in the thick atmosphere of excrement and iodoform. The hospital orderlies staggered rather than walked, for they were terribly tired. Nothing was to be seen of the gleaming bed linen of the photographs. Covered with blood-stained rags, the men lay on straw on the hard wood of the stretchers, and in each one of the cars there lay at least 2 or 3 dead among the dying and groaning. I spoke with the doctor who, as he admitted to me, had been nothing more than a dentist in a small Hungarian village and had had no surgical practice for years. He was in despair. He had already telegraphed ahead to 7 stations for morphine, but none was available. He had no more cotton, no fresh bandages, and it was still 20 hours away to the hospital in Budapest. He asked me to help him, for his own people were too fatigued. I tried, clumsy as I was, and found that I could at least be of some use in getting out at each station to fetch a few pails of water, bad, dirty water intended for the locomotive, but still refreshing, so that the men could be washed a bit, and the blood, which was constantly dripping on the floor, could be mopped up. Since all nationalities had been thrown together into this rolling coffin, the soldiers suffered additionally from the babblish confusion of tongues. Neither the doctor nor the orderlies understood Ruthenian or Croatian. The only one who could be of some help was an old white-haired priest who, like the doctor who was in despair for want of morphine, complained for his part that he lacked the oil for the last sacraments. In all his long life, he had never administered to so many people as during the past month. It was from him that I heard the words that I was never to forget, spoken in a hard, angry voice. I am 67 and I have seen much, but I would never have believed such a crime on the part of humanity possible. The hospital train in which I was returning arrived in Budapest in the early morning hours. I drove at once to a hotel to get some sleep. My only seat in the train had been my bag. Tired as I was, I slept until about 11 and then quickly got up to get my breakfast. I had gone only a few paces when I had to rub my eyes to make sure that I was not dreaming. It was one of those brilliant summer days that are spring in the morning and summer at noon, and Budapest was as beautiful and carefree as ever before. Women in white dresses walked arm in arm with officers who suddenly appeared to me to be officers of quite a different army than that I had seen only yesterday and the day before yesterday. With the odor of iodoform of yesterday's ambulance train still in my clothes, my mouth, my nose, I saw how they bought bunches of violets and gallantly tendered them to their ladies, saw spotless automobiles with smoothly shaved and spotlessly dressed gentlemen ride through the streets. And all this but 8 or 9 hours away from the front by express train. But by what right could one judge these people? Was it not the most natural thing that, living, they sought to enjoy their lives? That because of the very feeling that everything was being threatened, that they had gathered together all that was to be gathered, the few fine clothes, the last good hours. It was just because one had seen how frail and perishable man is, whose life with all its memories, ecstasies, and knowledge can be destroyed in the thousandth part of a second by a little piece of lead, that one understood why multitudes thronged to the gleaming river to join in the morning promenade, to see the sun, to feel themselves, their own blood, their own lives with perhaps heightened power. I had become almost reconciled to what at first had shocked me, but unfortunately the attentive waiter just then brought me a Viennese newspaper. I tried to read it, and only then was I filled with rage and disgust. Here were all the phrases about the inflexible will to conquer, about the petty losses of our own troops and the gigantic losses of the enemy. Here it jumped out at me, naked, towering, and unashamed, the lie of the war. No, it was not the promenaders, the careless, the carefree, who were to blame, but those alone who drove the war on with their words. But we too were guilty if we did not do our part against them. It was only now that the true impulse was given me. One had to fight. Against war. The material lay ready within me. Only this last visible confirmation of my instinct had been lacking to make me start. I had recognized the foe I was to fight. False heroism that prefers to send others to suffering and death. The cheap optimism of the conscienceless prophets, both political and military, who, boldly promising victory, prolonged the war, and behind them the hired chorus, the word makers of war, as Werfel has pilloried them in his beautiful poem. Whoever voiced a doubt hindered them in their patriotic concerns. Whoever uttered a warning was ridiculed as a pessimist. Whoever fought against the war in which they themselves did not suffer was branded as a traitor. It has always been the same. The eternal pack throughout the times, calling the prudent cowardly, the humane weak, only to be supine themselves in the hour of catastrophe which they themselves wantonly conjure up. It was always the same pack, the same who derided Cassandra in Troy, Jeremiah in Jerusalem, and never had I sensed the greatness and the tragedy of those figures as in these all too similar hours. From the very beginning, I had no faith in victory and was certain of but one thing, that even if it could be achieved by immeasurable sacrifice, it could never justify that sacrifice. But I remained always alone among my friends with this warning, and the confused shouting about victory before the first shot, the division of the spoils before the first battle, often caused me to wonder if I alone were mad among all these wise men, or perhaps alone horribly aware in the midst of their intoxication. So it became only natural for me to describe my own situation, the tragic situation of the defeatists. The word had been invented to make those who strove for understanding seem to desire defeat, in a dramatic form. I chose for my symbol the figure of Jeremiah, the man of futile warnings. I had no intention of writing a pacifist play, or to set in words and verses the truth that peace was better than war, but to portray the man who in time of enthusiasm is despised as the weakling, the timid one, but who in the hour of defeat proves himself to be the only one able not only to endure it, but also to master it. From the time of my first play, Thersites, I had frequently occupied myself with the problem of the spiritual superiority of the vanquished. I was always tempted to depict the internal hardening which every form of power brings about in man, the spiritual numbness of an entire people which every victory entails, and to contrast it with the energizing power of defeat that plows through the soul so painfully and fruitfully. In the midst of war, while others, prematurely triumphant, were proving to one another the certainty of victory, I already threw myself to the lowest abyss of the catastrophe and was seeking the way out. But in choosing a biblical theme I had unknowingly touched upon, something that had remained and used in me up to that time, that community with the Jewish destiny, whether in my blood or darkly founded in tradition. Was it not my people that again and again had been conquered by all other peoples, again and again, and yet outlasted them because of some secret power, that power of transforming defeat through will, of withstanding it again and again? Had they not presaged, our prophets, this perpetual hunt and persecution that today again scatters us upon the highways like chaff? And had they not affirmed this submission to power, and even blessed it as a way to God? Had trial not eternally been of profit to all and to the individual? Happily, I realized this while working at my drama, the first of all my works that means something to me. I know today, without all that I suffered in sympathy and in anticipation during the war, I would have remained the writer I had been before the war, pleasantly agitated, as certain pieces of music are marked, but never fixed, composed and responsive to my very vitals. Now, for the first time, I had the feeling that when I spoke, it came from myself and from my time. In my effort to help others, I had helped myself toward my most personal, most intimate work besides Erasmus, by means of which in 1934, in the days of Hitler, I extricated myself from a similar crisis. From the moment when I attempted to shape them, I no longer suffered so greatly from the tragedy of the times. I had never believed for a single moment that my work might have a visible success. Because of the many problems, the prophetic, the pacifist, and the Jewish, and the choral structure of the closing scenes which rise to a hymn of the vanquished to his fate, The length of my poem had grown so far beyond that of a normal drama that an actual presentation would have required 2 or 3 evenings in the theater. What is more, how could a play that not only announced defeat, but even praised it be given on a German stage, while the papers were daily blasting forth victory or annihilation? It would even be miraculous if the book were permitted to be published, but if the worst came to the worst and nothing happened, it had at least helped me at a dire time. I had said in poetic dialogue everything that I had to withhold in my conversation with those around me. I had thrown off the burden that had rested on my soul and had been restored to myself. In the very hour in which everything in me was no against the times, I had found the yes to myself. In
Okay, just listen some the novel, which name The World of Yesterday by Zweig. It's very nice, the novel. But cat might thought it's noise for cat. So he changed his place, go to the neighbors. Okay, finished today. Bye bye, see you tomorrow.